we're trying to add value within these sessions for some of the people registered to come, and also just for people who attend, that these are available. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. I'm Doug Dobbins, for the one or two of you who don't know me, and those of you who are that way should consider yourself lucky. Now you've joined the Luckily Regular group. These stem out of a thing that Andrew and I started, which is we're trying to get technical communities more involved with the people who write laws that affects us, and get input from transportation, education system, anything which makes it hard to do business in the state or easy to do business in the state, to making sure that people who are as lucky as ourselves have the right opportunities to move forward and contribute in life and do what they're doing. And Washington State, the big part of that's education. The gentlemen which are here, I'll let them introduce themselves and give their own mini bios, but they cover a fair amount of the gamut of education, and this is really, no question is dumb, no question's too smart. They're very willing to take their time, both their state representatives. I really appreciate them for coming, because it's been a little hard. We're close to the 4th, so they'll going. And this is a good time. You hear something you like, great. You hear something you don't. And at the end of this, what I'm going to start doing is develop an email list so people can get in contact. Because at the end of the day, it's good for people. I look at other states like California, where it's very easy for the legislators to get feedback from the technical community. And to pick on one of my former employers, Microsoft, they didn't even start lobbying the state legislature and really working with them to give their business point of view until 2 years ago. Which, as much as economy they control, that's pretty impressive. Not impressive. I come from a farming community areas originally, being Spokane. Trust me, every farmer goes after their representatives or have groups which do, and they can go in there. And it's just important. It's just important for them to know, because they can't be experts in everything.
Just to start off with a basic question, what is a state representative in comparison to a senator and all those other positions?
This is not the Doug show. This is their show. I'm only here to moderate, so that's a good first question after they introduce themselves. Go ahead and explain what your role in their life is.
We control everything you do.
Introduce first.
I'm Representative Glenn Anderson from the 5th Legislative District. The district I represent is Issaquah, Sammamish, Snoqualmie Valley, Maple Valley, basically everything from Issaquah to Snoqualmie Pass. And then from Redmond south to Enumclaw, unincorporated King County. I was first elected in 2000. My background is 20 years as a banker and management consultant, and I serve on the K-12 committee along with Skip. Skip's the ranking member, I'm the assistant ranking member. I am the ranking member of the higher education committee. Skip was on the higher education committee. I also,
ranking member for the
when you're in the minority, you're a ranking member. When you're in the majority, you're a chairman or a chairperson. You run the show. I also sit on the appropriations committee, which is the one that doles out all the dough. It's the one that makes a state budget. And then there are a number of other committees. I'm the co-chair of the bipartisan high-tech caucus in the legislature. I sit on the Information Services Board, which oversees all the IT project management that goes on in the state. And I also sit on two innocuous committees called the Joint Legislative Audit Review, which is the Performance Audit Committee. Again, it's bipartisan. And then there's what's called the LEAP Committee, which is about accounting, transparency, and rules, things like that. And last but not least, I serve on what is called the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, which is a commonwealth, a statutory commonwealth between Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, British Columbia, Alberta, and the Yukon territories. We're like a mini EU of the North. Yeah, so people put that. Yeah, people put the label on it. The short story is in our state constitution, state representatives serve 2-year terms. State senators serve 4-year terms. There are 49 legislative districts around the state. Each has 2 representatives and 1 senator. They are all the same. You actually, from one legislative district, all the people in that district will vote on their 3 elected positions. In some states, the House boundaries and the Senate boundaries, like in California, don't align. And there are 9 state elected officials, so roughly.
My name's Skip Priest. I'm state representative for the 30th district, which is primarily Federal Way, and then South King County, over the hill, Dalgona, and Pacific. Our districts are about 125,000 people, if you give or take a little, 125 to 130, kind of twice the kingdom, which is itself is a little awe-inspiring when you think about it. In fact, I was sitting there at Questfield, and I realized the 5 people that write those nice letters saying what a good guy I am, and then the other 5 who write letters to me to say I'm really not a nice, very, very nice guy. In the grand scheme of things, we actually have a responsibility to a much larger group, and so it's important to hear from everybody. At the same time, it's our responsibility to put things in perspective as well, because we tend to represent quite a few people. By way of background, I'm a former executive at American Express Company as well as Burlington Northern, and was a small business person for about 15, 17 years with my own businesses. I've been a former mayor of Federal Way and was elected in 2002, 2 years after Glenn. As Glenn suggested, he and I tend to be 2 of the people in the Republican Party. Fred Jarrett would be the 3rd, who take a lead on higher education as well as K-12 education. Fred is the representative from the 41st District, which is primarily Mercer Island and Renton and
East parts of Issaquah.
Part of Issaquah, part of Bellevue. And so what's happened is over the years we tend to work very closely together. As Glenn also said, I'm the ranking member on the House Education Committee as well as the House Education Finance Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. I also serve on appropriations. I guess one unique thing would be I'm a trustee of the Life Sciences Discovery Fund, which is the biotechnology initiative, where we're spending $35 million a year in terms of investments in biotechnology. That's a group of 4 legislators and 7 members of the business and other communities. I guess the thing that I find the most interesting when it comes to education is we always would like to have definitive answers, and there aren't. We would all like to think that we were the ones who knew and everybody else did not know as well. In the world of education, interestingly enough, everybody's an expert. I learned that, in fact. When I was the ranking or the lead Republican on the Judiciary Committee, and I know Glenn can say the same thing about higher education, you walk in, the caucus is there, the 35, 45 members, you say this is House Bill 1222, it does such and such, I recommend you vote yes. Are there any questions? Everybody kind of looks around and says no, and you walk out. When you're the ranking member of education, however, when you walk in, you say House Bill 2223, it says such and such, everybody's an expert in education. They've either gone to school or going to school, they've got kids in school, parents have gone to school, grandparents have gone to school, and so it tends to, interestingly enough, reflect the debate about education. It would be nice to say that there is an answer, but what we found is even if there was, nobody would agree to it because they're all experts. And so it makes the challenge of identifying clear policy as far as education concerned from the standpoint of legislation probably as great a challenge as any subject that we have. Glenn was the representative for Washington Learns, which you may have read about in the newspaper. He was on the overall committee that reviewed both early learning, K-12 and higher education. I was on the...
Explain people how that does, because a lot of people in this room probably doesn't know about Washington Learn. Well, I should be doing that.
Yeah.
Please explain Washington Learns here in a moment, because it's a committee which governor gets some appointment, and it has people from business. I mean, Mr. Watt from Boeing's on it. It's sort of, who's up there in Boeing's management. It's sort of a good introduction for people. I think that should be a topic you both discuss about how it works in the legislature and what they come up with and what they don't touch on that.
I'm going to hand that over to Glenn because he was the bullseye for that whole debate. Washington Learns was an initiative by the governor. The legislature asked the governor and a group to come up with a clear finance study and approach to education and how we pay for it. Education, and the one thing you have to remember in our state, is that it is the only thing we actually have to spend money on. In the Constitution, the paramount duty of the legislature is to provide funding for basic education. Everything else, interestingly enough, we don't have to do. We make political decisions based on the ability to pay for things or not pay for things. But I'm going to hand over the The reason Washington Learns is so important is because how it failed, and Glenn knows better than anybody, and it has set us up into the position we're in right now, good or bad.
Ever since the original funding framework for K-12 education was developed by essentially state Supreme Court order back in 76, 78, and actually there's some later decisions into the early 80s. There have been inequities that have been built in that, and it's a formula driven. I mean, the way the system is designed to work is the fact that the money follows the child, and these formulas for any number of things I call it the tipping water buckets. They all tip and all the water, and then at your school district for that child, X amount of dollars comes out. Those inequities have been around for a while and create some enormous problems of real equity between kids and school districts, whether they're across the state or across the back fence. It really is that kind of problem. Well, 4 years ago, the legislature, it sort of built a head of pressure up because we had such a significant economic downturn, and that Initiative 728, which is small class size, and Initiative 732, which was COLAs, increases for teachers, had to be suspended. And in that, under that kind of pressure, the legislature said, we want a task force to comprehensively evaluate what the state's funding structure is for K-12. We want you to take a look at each side of the pipeline, the early learning and the higher ed, but what you must do is bring us a stable, organized approach to address the funding inequities in the system. We met for about 18 months. We covered a lot of different ground. Inherently, anytime you're talking about how much money do you spend, it's what would it be on, and you get into some of the policy debates like what is the achievement testing model we should have in the state? Is it more WASL? Is it less WASL? Is it something else? At the end of the day, the task force avoided deliberately and publicly responding to the letter of the law that said you shall come up with recommendations to fix, evaluate and fix. Specifically, that was a choice of the governor, and then the report came out. I wrote a minority report which said you're breaking the law, you really can't do that, here's what the legislature said. And that was fairly promptly ignored. And people went on to say, okay, we have these programs that we want to see. And what happened is we layer all these good ideas one on top of another, but we never really fully fund them. We never really complete the training of the people who would do that, because it's sort of like brass plaques on a bridge. You know, hey, it's my bridge. Look, my name is on that program now. Politically, people are happy. For whatever her reasons, the governor chose not to address those issues as laid out in the law. And during this legislative session, we had close to 1.3 in new operating funds.
That's billion.
Yeah, 1.3 billion that were allocated to K-12 education, and yet not a single one of the structural issues that we know to exist and they're commonly agreed to on a bipartisan basis was addressed. Not one. So it's been frustrating to us to sit there, and we start a legislative session with a $2 billion surplus. First time in 10 years the state has started a budget session with a surplus of any kind, let alone $2 billion. We know the major issues within the K-12 funding structure that need to be fixed, and yet, in the end, none of those issues were addressed. Something even as simple as getting kids to school on the bus.
So backing you up to,
Oops, I got that. Okay.
yeah. So backing up to like defining the problem. So I heard both of you talking about, there's not an answer. Well, there's not going to be an answer until someone agrees upon a definition of what is the problem. And it sounds like you're talking about a problem in inequity. Can you enlighten us a little bit about, A, where the monies are coming from, and B, what you mean by inequity?
The state's constitution says it is the paramount duty to provide a general and uniform system. And what we do as a state, we have three things, really just two things we offer: money and police power. That's about it. And the challenge is when we have general and uniform, every child, wherever that classroom is, whatever the formulas are that we allocate money from, should in fact be general and uniform, so that a child in this district and a child in this district have the same opportunity to get the amount of money, say, for special ed or the bus ride, food service, the kind of teachers they get. Based on the political decisions back in the 70s and early 80s, teacher salaries. We're supposed to fund teacher salaries at a uniform level, so a kid in Pomeroy, Washington, and a kid in Bellingham, Washington, or downtown Seattle versus Mercer Island, their teacher salary all start at the same level. Well, to get the deal done back then, they said, oh, well, you're starting at a higher level, so we're going to grandfather you in. We've got this uniform level, but you're good at this higher level, don't you worry about it. And those kind of inequities in terms of actual dollars. Now, the challenge we have is a lot of people use per pupil spending dollar amounts as as like a benchmark or a scorecard to say, oh, we're doing better. All data, all research says if you said these kids are getting $900 per pupil and these kids are getting $1,200 per pupil, that has absolutely no impact on academic achievement. Zero, none, nada. Can't prove it anywhere. So we get caught between we have a general and uniform requirement, and yet the differentials don't allow us to sit there and say this makes a substantial academic difference, and the arguments just go and go and go.
So that the requirement for the uniform dollars per pupil, whatever they are, allocation comes from the state Supreme Court decisions?
Yes.
Okay. And the monies come out of the general fund? There's no local property tax monies that go into school districts? Okay.
We joke about this. Glenn and I have probably a 7 or 8 knowledge of education finance in K-12. That's the bad news. And the worst news is Glenn and I are in the top 5 in the legislature because education finance is an extraordinarily difficult, and it's not partisan, it's just a very, very complicated. When Glenn was talking about the inequities, we used probably 2 very easy examples to talk about. 1, inequities, and 2, the lack of funding, what we call funding the fundamentals. The easiest example in terms of education is concerned, and I say it's easy when you start it, is because of those earlier court decisions, the city of Everett, teachers in Everett get $3,000 more on the grid, which is, it's a grid that, you know, if you have a master's and you've been teaching 8 years, doesn't talk about competence, but just you're on the grid.
It's all time and education level.
That's the grid. The grid for Everett teachers is $3,000 more for the grid for federal wage teachers, and the reason was we had failed 6 or 7 levies in a row right during that critical time in the 80s, and so our teachers were not getting paid anything. Well, Everett had passed a series of levies in which those teachers were getting paid at this level. And so you may want to talk about all you want about uniform, but the reality is on the grid that the state's paying out, Everett teachers, for example, get $3,000 more than federal wage teachers. Now you think, well, that's easy. We'll just fix that so that everybody gets the same. 2 things occurred. The first is, much to everybody's surprise, that's $150 million a year, or $300 million a biennium. And even on a $13.5 billion K-12 budget or a $33 billion overall budget, you start talking about $400 million bumps for one particular thing, which doesn't benefit everybody. I mean, the Everett teachers are very excited about federal wage teachers coming up to their level, but they're really not because they really want more. They're human. So that's one area where the inequities, we took some very small strides. The second one, which is also a very clear example, like it or not, we, under our own state laws, say this is how much we're going to pay for buses. That is just getting the kids to class. The Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee that Glenn sits on said, we are failing in that responsibility by $200 million across the state. We're failing in that responsibility. And so this particular legislative session, we managed to put $25 million towards that, solving that problem, which still means that school districts across the state are going to have to take out of levies, which are supposed to be for extras, $175 million, of which we've already promised that we would, in fact, do. And so those are the kind of, one, it's complex, but two, whenever you make even small changes, as far as education, either philosophy, staffing, or even the basics like classified staff and buses, they're big dollars. And they're big dollars because we got in the K-12 system a million kids, 55,000 teachers, I don't know how many superintendents, principals, but so it's and Washington Learns, in one of those, I was on the K-12 committee, and I was sitting there, and we brought in some very interesting people named Pikus and Auden, who are the experts in the state, in the country. And we were all excited about the concept of providing an evidence-based approach to funding. In other words, that's what everybody said, it's a great idea. Wow, we're all excited about it. So they come in here, and they do an analysis, and every draft in our K-12 says, we're using evidence-based, we are using evidence-based. Well then, the governor's office did a analysis, because we've said, what's the proper class size? How many nurses should we have? For special ed, what can we assume in most buildings we should see for an addition to make sure they get the type of help they deserve? And they went through this whole long list of things. It was really exciting. We're rolling. And then the governor's office does the analysis, and it's never been released, but it's somewhere between $3 and $6 billion, right, that we're short. And suddenly, evidence-based disappeared. Never heard again. Right out of the drafts. And that also triggered, I believe, the decision by Washington Learns and the governor to say, whoops, we aren't going to do what we were required to do by law, which was provide an education finance. What's interesting then about that, in the real world we live in, is that we currently have an adequacy lawsuit by the WA, by a number of school districts, as well as a number of other groups, that are saying the funding's not adequate. And they are, in fact, have just made a request, a discovery request for the results of that study. And so it's going to get kind of complex, and it's a very big number. The other thing that's interesting about it is, for those of us who studied, is you can talk all you want about evidence-based, but the fact is that even their report is anecdote-based. I'm reminded of the difficulty. Decatur High School, my district, was ground zero for not a nice place to go. So they brought in Jerry Millett, who was a former Catholic priest. And Jerry would stand right out there in that hallway. And he'd say, John, I know I'm in the hallway, I'm just not sure why you are. And Jill, you didn't really get that assignment in last time, did you? We agreed you were going to get that assignment in. What happens around, when you look at a lot of these studies, if we'd have gone to Jerry and said, you know, I'll tell you what, Jerry, if you increase everybody by 3% in terms of their academic achievement, 5%, pick a number, we're going to give everybody ice cream. Really? Yeah. And so sure enough, everybody in Decatur at the end of the year would have increased 5%. And so now we've decided statewide we've got to give everybody ice cream as an incentive to get that type of improvement. If we do, then everybody will be successful. The fact is, you could have told Jerry Millett at the end of it, I'm going to give you a $10 Starbucks card, and those same kids would have done 5% increase, because that was a building, and that was a principal, and that were teachers who were dedicated, classified staff, as well as students and parents who all of a sudden said to themselves, we need to improve how we were doing it before. It's not as successful. And so that's part of the problem when you start looking for clear solutions or evidence-based approach. The irony about that evidence-based approach and why it's so interesting, if you're a big money guy like Glenn and I, is that in Arkansas, they went to the Arkansas Supreme Court, and the Arkansas Supreme Court said it's not satisfactory. You're not funding at the proper level. And so they brought in Pikus and Auden after, as opposed to before. And Mr. Pikus and Mr. Auden said, you're short $983 million or something like that, and the legislature was forced to write a check. So in the real world, you kind of joke about this anecdotal stuff, but in the real world, the complex nature is not necessarily easy solutions, but when they're found and people nod, they can be big dollars.
But one of the things you have to, and the whole thing with educational consultants out there, when they get a contract with the state, and Pakistan is a good example about it, okay, because it's broad, it's antidote-based, and it's going to be a long-term deal, these contracts, and this is a small group of people, they're just the experts, they're walking away with $500,000 annual contracts. $500,000. Just to sit there and say, well, you're close, but you didn't quite do it our way, and that'll be another $500,000 next year so we can hold your hand. And there's this culture that's developed around, because it is hard to come to consensus that the consultant, the expert, is a surrogate facilitator, it's sort of a surrogate vessel for all the conflict, as opposed to us sitting around this table going, what is it that we really agree on, and let's agree to execute it, and then we'll come to the next things that we almost agree on, and then we'll deal with those things that we really disagree on. These people go around and make a fortune in almost all other states that are not radically different from ours in the way, and they just come up and they have a template about what it should be. And then they get paid for a long time in big numbers to nurture the process. In the meantime, nothing is fixed.
There's a different motivation that deals with that.
Well, I mean, when you're talking about evidence-based, okay, whether your evidence is the WASL or your evidence is something else, discussion I had with Fred when he talked to the Senate at UW is, again, what is important and what are you measuring? Because people will teach to the measurement, as you just pointed out with your ice cream example. And so we know anecdotally of teachers in K through 12 who teach to WASL or teach wherever you are where a child has one of those kinds of standardized tests. All that means is the kid knows how to answer a standardized test. It doesn't mean that there's learning going on. That's my soapbox.
That's one of the great debates that we're right in the middle of right now. I mean, there are two things going on. There are actually three things going on. One is the whole standards discussion, particularly in math and science, which Glenn has been a leader on from the very beginning. The second is, once we figure out what the standard is, what should the test be? And the final thing is education finance. And much to Glenn's and my dismay, there's another education finance study group, which Glenn and I will be on, along with a number of governors, kind of a Washington Learns light, or a Washington Learns we didn't deal with the issue we were supposed to, and so now we're going to hand it off
Again.
Or we call that version 2, we market and we sell it only for $99 for upgrade price.
Yeah, that's you're right. It's we hope it's an upgrade because the last one didn't work. But
Don't you think it would have been political suicide to say we need $6 billion more for education?
why be the governor?
Yeah, right.
In other words, I hate to, and I'm not choosing her either, by the way. And this isn't a partisan comment at all, but you have to lead. Dan Evans would say, "I want $3 billion today and $3 billion in 5 years," because he did that when he and Booth Gardner said we need more money in the higher education area for capital expenses. And we had the Evans Gardner, and they just kept coming down and kept coming down and kept coming down until finally we passed a bill. I was on the capital budget committee, which we did it. That's another aside. Now, I don't know why anybody wants to be governor unless they don't want to lead. No, it's not that nice a house. You don't get paid that much.
Bats are gone.
The bats are gone, thanks to Governor Locke's leadership.
Everybody picks that too.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is why be there unless you don't want to lead. And if it's $6 billion, it's $6 billion, but you got to be able to defend it and say this is why. And that's your job.
But yeah, I want you to.
So I mean, from that standpoint, I'll hand it over to Glenn, but I want to talk about this assessment, some of the other things we're working
Actually, I
on.
have something that flows in after he talks for assessment, which was a question by someone you can hear.
The issue of leadership is big. I mean, culturally, whether it's internationally, nationally, statewide, in our local community, the question, everybody talks leadership. And one of the realities is that the second people do it, you change the status quo. You rock the boat, you move the wheel to where you're progressing toward an outcome. Well, next thing you know, everybody's loaded up with flamethrowers, grenades, and machine guns, and bullets. I mean, it gets very, very heady, very fast. When you change the cultural norm that people are talking about, no matter how griping they are, it should be different. When you start changing that, people get very antsy very quickly, and that's natural. It's always been that way. But in particular, with the Washington Learns approach and the issues, we know that there is a funding problem. It is commonly agreed upon. We had essentially almost a 3.5-year process when you talk about the time for debating the legislation to get it up, get it going. Okay, here it is, what we're going to talk about. We have 2 in particular lawsuits. During the session, we had 3. We had a $2 billion surplus. And like I said, there's actually very little disagreement on what needs to be fixed, and there's only slightly more disagreement on the alternatives. It's more like tweaking versus here's a radical A and a radical B. So if the state constitution says it is the paramount duty of the state, paramount, defined as superior to all other things, not maybe, not if. It's not meant to be balanced. It's not meant to be fair. It's meant to be paramount to all other things. So you've got the $2 billion. You generally have the solutions set and the players at the table. You have the pressure of outside third-party lawsuits. And you do, and the governor in this case, and like I said, this is generic. This could apply to any governor making these kinds of decisions. Education is our currency of a 21st century global economy. That marker's on the ground. And when we get through with the session, all the $2 billion is spent, none of the structural issues are addressed, and indeed, K-12 education funding came third in terms of new dollars spent. So when we say leadership, words have consequences. When we set up expectations as political leaders, words have consequences. If it's just, what does it take to get a headline or make a good soundbite and then run as fast as you can to make a deal with somebody else going in another direction, no wonder people are cynical. And it's very hard to get any sort of consensus when people go, yeah, they all do it. So it's a very germane point.
So since this is Mind Camp, I got a couple of questions from people if this was videotaped that they wanted to take direction, and I'm going to give them both out now and let you answer them. One is, and for some people here, I'm going to put in blunt terms, you may not agree with this, the WASL is a test for the lower end student. It's the making sure the lower end student at least meets the bar. One of the problems for people in this state is how do we take care of the upper end student? And the questions are twofold which came in. One, since we're Mind Camp and people here revolving around technology, how do you see us other than busing transportation? Because this person was very aware of busing transportation being expensive. I'm going to use my sample since his would give away his identity, and since I'm not here, I'm going to pick is how can a kid in Republic get the same quality chemistry school education in a tight district, which is not getting the economic boom of our area is? They're tearing down houses, to be honest, who's bright, brilliant, we want them to have this opportunity. What kind of technologies can we do it when you can't get a teacher up there and they don't have the budget? How are we going to ensure this kid so that as our education, these businesses here are bringing people in, we're not growing a lot of our own, both nationally and internationally. And two, what are we going to do to prove even past advanced placement to get the upper ed student, which is the other half of special education, why most people figure on the lower end. Special education in many districts is defined as both. How are we going to start addressing that to grow our future PhD candidates, our future business leaders? How are we going to make more Bill Gateses in this state, which gives the rest of us jobs? That's really what it comes down to.
First of all, I think that's a very good question, and it has to do with equity. One of the biggest challenges of the system, which you described. Now, I grew up in Brewster, in Eastern Washington. It is in the largest graduating class ever, 42, and it's in Chelan. And so we were not particularly engaged in AP and other things. You know, I worked every night and we went to school, and that's just the way it was. So I think, first of all, that's a very good question. Number one is the WASL is, in fact, the baseline. It has never been intended to be anything else except the fundamental baseline by the end of your 10th grade that you've learned the basics, however we define those basics. It's not meant by the time you graduate. We can't congratulate ourselves by saying, wow, that person by the 12th grade has a 10th grade graduation ability, and on top of it, when you look at the WASL, it's really only 7th and 8th grade math when compared to other states and around the country. So from that standpoint, part of the problem is the fact that is this tension between individual and mass. We have 1 million kids in the system, and I personally would like to have one teacher for each one of them. I would like to have one plan for each one of them so that they could move according to their speed. Maybe one would be graduated at age 14, one would graduate at age 30. The fact is, when you have 1 million kids, there's only so much you can do in terms of mass production. And that's the thing we wrestle with. We'd all like to give that person one teacher or one paraeducator, but we can't. And so you're constantly fighting that balance between helping those kids who need help and ensuring that those kids that are higher up are given more opportunity. And I think equity becomes at least part of it, because most of the schools in the larger cities, like Bellevue, Federal Way, Issaquah, Spokane, Brian Benzel, before he left, the whole crew, there are opportunities for kids who want to take them in AP or International Baccalaureate or other opportunities. I mean, my daughter is in lowly Thomas Jefferson High School in Federal Way, graduated with an International Baccalaureate degree just 2 weeks ago. She's on her way to Cornell Engineering. So the system didn't slow her down as far as opportunity was concerned. Now, the bigger issue is Republic, OMAC, Brewster. And I think we're trying to address it in probably 2 or 3 areas, and I'm not sure we're doing very well. First of all, we are giving more funds to the Digital Learning Commons, which is an attempt to use the internet and others to get information. And Federal Way, interesting enough, has the Internet Academy. We're on the leading edge there, which is one of the programs that gets information and opportunity not only to our students in the Federal Way School District, but to other students around. We also have Running Start. Again, that takes a decision by the parents and the kids that they want to do something more, that they do not want to be their junior and senior at Decatur or Thomas Jefferson or Brewster High School, but it also means a drive to Wenatchee from Brewster, which is 60 miles every morning and 60 miles every day. So I think the thing I hope what we're going to do is, number one, is we're going to clarify and ultimately make more intense the baseline. And you're seeing more and more states around the country doing that. And then second of all, we're going to hope that we can continue to invest and learn how to use the internet in other ways so that these kids within a classroom situation in OMAC or through video conferencing or some kind of technology will be able to sit in on that class in Bellevue, because we're never going to be able to get that AP type teacher consistently in the Nooksack Valleys and the Brewsters of the world. And so somehow we're going to have to do that bridge.
I'll let him answer.
I had just as you were talking about how to use technology, I had a kind of a question or comment mixed with question. From what I've seen recently, the way that they've been introducing kids to technology, to me seems almost like it defeats basic education, like typing in a word into a dictionary rather than actually flipping through and learning how to use a dictionary, or things like spell check, or that automatically correct your words for you and things like that. So video conferencing, I think, is a great way of using technology, for the betterment of education. But what other things do you think are need to be taught to children nowadays? Because like I have a 3-year-old who at 3 is doing things that I only learned how to do when I was 16, just because of how fast technology and things like that are growing. And I'm sure he's not the only one of his kind. Is education keeping up with that? Are kids learning about how like basic navigation of the internet and how to look up things traditionally as well as the new way and things like that?
I've been dealing with computers really since the early and mid 80s when they first came out. Everybody's going, how do you do it with it? And essentially, a computer is a 10-speed filing cabinet. That's the bottom line. And when it's hooked up to other 10-speed 10-key filing cabinets, network, then it becomes a real multiplier. Then you get the exchange of data and you get that innovation and creativity. Before the internet came along, it really was. It's a bigger box on my desk. One of the things that I have found very interesting, and there have been, surprisingly enough, a limited number, not small number, but limited number. What are the real impacts on technology on education? And for all the money, the Gates Foundation and all that, in the end, the results are interesting in the sense that there is no data that says a technology education is better. It's a different learning experience, but there's no qualification that it's a better learning experience. And that is something when we're all talking about, we need to be wired. I can't even walk around my house with a cell phone now because I get static on it. I've got so much electrical juice going through the place. So that's one issue that we need to sort of keep as a marker when we make those evaluations. The second thing is kids still need to be kids. The biggest challenge we have with education is socialization. Whether it's young men in video games or young women avoiding computers altogether, in the end we get the same product of not being able to apply the technology in a constructive manner. And so the most important thing about a technological education, learning, is good parenting. That is the most important thing, basic, whatever your definition of family values, of learning, of respect, that is the most important thing. And a lot of times this becomes the surrogate. It's busy, it's a distraction, it's a new toy. They'll be quiet, they'll be busy. And that is exactly the wrong outcome.
It was very interesting. In fact, I was at the University of Washington last week meeting with their early learning group up there. And that point was made directly, in which they were talking about the value of all these things that you can show on your television to kids about numbers and all that kind of thing. And the bottom line is they provided no learning value whatsoever. None. And so you found yourself in a situation where many parents they did a poll in which they asked the parents, why are you doing this? Why are you why are the kids in front of the television all the time? I'm not sure that the parents told the truth. In fact, I asked them about that. But most of the parents said they thought if they provided these quality education videos and everything, that they were doing their kids a favor, that they were helping educate them. When in fact, the other group of parents said they're babysitting. But the fact was, according to the group there, it was the interaction between the parents or the kids that is where the learning occurred, and not watching a television. And it was fascinating because you just have to go into the newspaper and see all the opportunities to see all these ways for kids to learn via TV, and the studies showed zero. And so that became one of the more interesting questions I asked, is I said, well, we're having this huge debate about K-3 or kindergarten education, where we're doing full day versus half day. And should they be sitting at a computer in a classroom like this, or should they be home with their parents or with their siblings kind of running around? And they said, well, if it's a very, very bad relationship at home, and it's a good relationship in the kindergarten, they should have all-day kindergarten. And they said, if it's a room like this, and they're not at home with their brothers and sisters, or with a parent, and interesting enough, parent is broadly defined, it's anybody who's alive. It's not, it doesn't come from mom and dad necessarily, it comes from somebody who actually is playing with the child, interacting with the child, giving them a chance to interact back to socialization. That Glenn was talking about is how the education occurs. And so there is, I think, a danger, assuming the University of Washington is right, but I think instinctively we all feel that way, is if we hand it over to technology education, we are not going to be doing what we need to be doing as far as kids, particularly at that early age, learning. They learn by socialization.
Can you give us two statistics?
One statistic is, so how much does a first-year high school teacher make in Federal Way? And the second statistic is, for all the kids that enter in the first grade this year, what % will graduate in 12 years?
Okay, I just have to have those at the top of my head. Out of 100% of the kids that take the 10th grade, or that are in 10th grade.
Okay, so you just cut out 10 years.
No, yeah, but I mean, the point is, and I'll come back, out of 100% of 10th grade kids, and 10th grade is really where the dropout point is. You know, you don't get a lot of dropouts before that. In 8th and 9th grade, you get what I would call strong hardship issues, but it's not the kid really making, okay, I'm done with this, I'm out of here. Of that, 70% will never get a 4-year degree. 70%. They may have some college, a couple of college classes somewhere.
Oh, well, but I mean graduate from high school.
Well, I know, but here's why the continuum is important. 70% will not get a 4-year degree. Of the 30% who do get a 4-year degree, half will go back to a community college for some sort of professional licensure kind of degree. Only 3 to 5% of that remaining 15% will get what are high demand computer science, chemistry, physics, mathematics, you know, the rocket science degrees. Those percentages have been very steady for a long period of time. When you have 30% of the dropouts, the 30% dropout rate is a piece of that 70%. Okay? So that is sort of that continuum. Now, in any particular school district, your percentages, if it's a high-income, you know, white suburban cul-de-sac, it's going to be different from a very challenged minority district. The other is the average, and even though for Federal Way, but the average for those teachers, the average teacher's salary in Washington State, and it's biased toward the high school because there's seniority at that point. There tends to be more seniority. Is about $46,000, and then when you add in local enhancements, what's called Tri-Dollars local pay incentives and benefits, it's $62,000.
So what about the person who's starting out who's just getting a 4-year degree from college in their first year? What do they make?
About $32,000 on the
Okay.
$32,000 from the state, plus whatever incentive comes from the local district, plus the benefits. When you get local incentive in there, it's 32. It's usually up to about 35, 36, average.
And Andrew?
What does the average person who comes out with a computer science degree make when they get out of college?
Double.
Well, what we found is interesting enough is that the one thing we learned was if there's been a dramatic change in teachers in terms of qualifications, is that the teachers today have lower SAT scores than they did 20 years ago.
Duh.
And the reason is because, which is almost obvious, is the fact that women have other options. That's been the major change. When you look across the entire landscape of who are teachers, and I'm not, and that's not to say, by the way, the SAT scores mean you're a good teacher or not, because that would be too easy. But interesting enough, that's part of the change, is the fact that high-quality women used to have that as a very clear avenue, particularly, frankly, in the rural areas, where they had a chance to have a career. They could take care of their kids, and they worked 9 months. They didn't work 12 months. And so what's happened is, while I don't think the quality of teachers necessarily has gone down, according to the University of Washington, the one statistic is very clear, and that is the SAT scores of new teachers are, in fact, down, in large part because women have other options. You know, it's interesting. It's easy to focus on the 32,000, which is important. But there are also, with all due respect to computer scientists, there are a whole lot of other people that work for $32,000 in their first job. Police. I mean, there are lots of people. And by the way, I might until our recent raise,
We qualify.
we qualify.
It was a part-time legislature.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much for reminding me. In fact, my wife was asking me the other day, when did the part-time start and the...
That is part-time. Anyone who's effective. Why no one holds a gun to your head to run, even once in my case. People do this. It's supposedly part-time, but to be effective, it isn't. And usually people find out your phone number, even if it's unlisted, or they'll be really rude and just come to your front door.
We're not, by the way, we're not complaining. We're grown-ups. We know the sacrifice. We're not, you know, I'm just, but the reality is lots of people work for passion or for other reasons because they believe what they're doing is important. To some degree, teachers are that. Ministers, elected officials, I mean, lots of people do that. So besides talent or specific ability, there are also other reasons we make choices in this world.
Well, I'm going to let you have the last question. I'm going to wrap, and then we're going to need to wrap it up. So is it going to be a quick question?
It could be, depending on how I answer it.
Okay, it's quick, and I'm going to put it in the one plug. This is to foster a start of a communication, not then. There's going to be an email list, bug these guys for cards, plug your cards into them, and also things to consider. This is part-time. Do we need to eventually maybe have a full-time legislature to get the right people and keep them focused on these ideas? This is to provoke a lot of thought. So your question, sir.
All right. So I guess one thing after this, if you guys could give me the name of the people that did the studies for how technology doesn't add any value to education, I'd greatly appreciate it if you knew it. But my question was, so in the WASL, I guess one good thing about the WASL is it grades people based on the process that they take when solving a problem. But so you're holding students to the standard of a process, which in organizational behavior research in business, they found that rewarding the process is much better than rewarding like an end statistic and end goal. And people are much more effective. And this is something I just learned last quarter in Management 300 at the University of Washington. And but teachers are being held to No Child Left Behind doesn't help, that if the school doesn't meet a certain percentage, that they then get cut funding, but they're not rewarding the process in the meantime. Or as far as I could see, they're not rewarding the process. So in rewarding the process is more effective than the rewarding a goal. What is the argument for rewarding teachers in schools based on a goal instead of the process?
First of all, my comment on the technology was, and I'll be glad to get you that, was television driven as opposed to other technology. Teacher compensation is one of the great discussion points that we have, because if you're going to compensate those who do better, then you have to make decisions on those who do worse. And so far, that's been a very difficult process within our education system, right or wrong, good or bad. It's if you look at the diagram to make changes as far as teachers are concerned, it doesn't happen. Or it doesn't happen very often. Second of all, we've wrestled with this issue of teacher compensation to reward those teachers who are in fact participating in the process, providing added value that some others may not. It's not easy there either in terms of figuring out exactly which students are doing well and which students aren't. And I wrestle with that. And this is not, the question is not, it does not have a short answer. We decided to give bonuses for national board certification. It's a very rigorous process this year. We've actually given it in the past, we put it in statute this year. So if a teacher is involved, it gets a national board certification, they get $5,000 more. And if they do it in a low-income school, they get $10,000 more. Interesting enough, most people agree that the board certification doesn't make you a better teacher. It's that better teachers actually care enough to get the national board certification, so it's a backdoor form of pay. I think the only reason that we've had to wrestle with the WASL or something is because people couldn't read and write when they got out of high school. And that was the bottom line, is the fact that we wanted kids to read and write, and so we created, with 1 million kids on the line, a test to try to decide how to measure that. And so far, we haven't penalized schools where they haven't actually. I mean,